Hello, welcome to this webinar on creating course pathways for advanced students and having a discussion on an example of this from the NGSS. My name is Jennifer Childress, Director of Instructional Supports for Science at Achieve. So throughout this webinar, we're going to collect your questions. Just type them into the chat box, and we'll have extended time for discussion during the second half of the webinar. But please send your questions all throughout as they come up, and we'll make sure that the panelists are able to address them. We're going to start out with a poll question to find out a little bit about the audience. So please select one of the groups or other. With which group do you identify? Are you a teacher, a school administrator, a district administrator? Are you from a state education agency or a different kind of organization? And we'll give you about 20 seconds to select one. And go ahead and wrap up your selections, and then we will display the results. All right, it looks like we have a mix of different groups, including at least a quarter educators in the audience. So I'm going to introduce my co-facilitator for this webinar. Teresa Eliopoulos is Senior Program Associate for Science at Achieve. Thank you, Jennifer. Welcome, everyone. To give you a little bit of background for those of you who are unfamiliar with Achieve, Achieve is a nonprofit organization committed to ensuring that all students graduate from high school, college, and career ready. By doing this, we work with states, partner organizations, and reform agencies to raise academic standards and graduation requirements, improve assessments, and strengthen accountability systems. A shift in education in the last few years has been the shift to college and career-ready standards for all students. This means that every student, regardless of educational attainment, should meet all of the standards. Now that means that there are some students that choose to go above and beyond the base standards, and that's what we are here to talk about today. What do we do for those advanced students, and what could potential course pathways look like? Great. Introducing our three panelists today, we have Ellen Ebert. Ellen is the Science Director in Teaching and Learning at the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Olympia, Washington. Sean Elkins is the Instructional Coach at Boone County High School in Florence, Kentucky. And Eric Kozer is an AP Physics teacher and regular physics teacher in Minnesota, where he has taught for over 22 years. So Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us a brief, before we turn it over to Eric, we're going to do a poll question to see if you all have read the document. And if you haven't, that's okay, be honest. We just want to gauge your familiarity. So please take a few seconds and answer. Have you read at least part of the NGSS Accelerated Model Course Pathways document prior to joining today? Great. Well, it looks like actually a decent amount of you have read the document, but for those of you who have not to worry. We will catch you up to speed and hopefully pique your interest enough so that you can read the document after the webinar. In case you are interested, you'll see over on in your panel where it says handouts. The document is available there in PDF for you to download. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Kozer, who will discuss a little bit about the development of this resource. Eric?
Hello and welcome everyone to this conversation about NGSS. It's exciting to have a chance to share, and I hope we can provide some useful ideas. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we developed this document first. Students that want to maximize their high school course experiences in science often take several AP or IB courses in core content areas during their later high school years, and we wanted to provide a logical pathway within the NGSS to build foundational skills and ideas that will best equip students that are ready earlier than most students for this challenge. So how did this happen? Well, a team of experienced AP teachers and curriculum leaders were pulled together for several days, and this team's charge was to really seek out logical storylines within the development of the scientific ideas. Now in NGSS those are called DCIs, or disciplinary core ideas. But we wanted to seek out those logical storylines for students within the NGSS and then build logical connections that tie these together through an accelerated journey, which now is called a model course pathway. So the typical pathway for a school using NGSS is to include all of the standards in 3 years of courses at the middle school and then 3 years of courses at the high school. But we chose to design 3 different options for this accelerated model that you'll hear about today, and you see some images on your screen that should help. One of those, the first one you see, is a 5-year model starting with grade 6. The second is a 4-year model that also starts in grade 6, and the third model is one where students could take courses that cover all of the NGSS within 2 years in high school via concurrent scheduling. In each of these 3 different cases, just for consistency, we started with the already existing NGSS conceptual progressions model pathways, and we worked from those as a building point. So the NGSS defines the critical science for all students, and that's really important that this is intended to be science for all students. But the structure of these accelerated NGSS model course pathways is really not for all students. These pathways provide an opportunity for advanced students to engage in the NGSS organized content differently than most students, and the goal is really to be assuring that first the early foundational ideas and skills for these students are accelerated to provide a solid foundation, and then to provide time for advanced coursework for these students while in high school as provided by AP or other advanced courses. So in particular, we really work to focus on pulling together highly related concepts that might appear within different content areas, and concepts that sometimes informed one another we placed together into a logical sequence. And then a third essential component was to really assure that whatever mathematical demand the ideas introduced was also consistent with the mathematics instruction that the students would typically be engaged in at the grade level they were at. If you'd like to look at specific examples of this within the handout that was referred to, you'll find them on page 10 and on page 17. But at this point, Sean Elkins is going to share about some of the assumptions that we've made in really building this document in the first place. Sean?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Eric. So one of the things that we think about in building any sort of model course pathway, or in fact a model of anything, is a basic idea in science that all models are flawed, but some models are useful. And so the idea being that no one particular set of course pathways can be the prescription for every particular mix of large district, small district, in between. And so these are starting points. They are places to begin conversations. They are a roadmap for thinking, but they are a roadmap that allows for detours. And so one of the assumptions that the group made when they got together was the idea that we are building a foundation of ideas. We are not building a holy writ. It is something that people can use as a starting point and deviate from as they need to. As Eric had mentioned earlier, one of the key assumptions that we made when we came together was the idea that let's start with the conceptual progression course sequences in Appendix K, because a lot of work had already been done thinking about how do you take the full breadth of the middle school standards and the full breadth of the high school standards and sequence them across multiple courses in a way that is logical and consistent. In particular, one of the things about the conceptual progressions model in Appendix K was the idea that it was an integrated model, and it had a nice storyline and a flow. There was a logic and a sequence to how the courses and even the performance expectations within the courses were structured. And so a decision was made to use that at least as our foundational starting point, because it will make more sense to be able to keep a coherent and cohesive storyline if we start with something that's structured that way anyway, besides having to deal with the obvious problem is that if you try to build courses that are structured along the science domains, i.e. life science, physical science, earth science, it becomes a weird division problem to say, okay, 3 courses divided by 2 years, which piece of content gets split and how so, and how do you call it? So the conceptual progressions model just made more sense. Another assumption that we made was the idea that if it's truly going to be an accelerated course, it needs to start before high school, that the middle school needs to be involved, that some of the content that is traditionally thought of and labeled in NGSS as high school content gets handed down to a very competent middle school teacher, and that handing down is done in such a way that it doesn't disrupt that conceptual flow I talked about earlier. And so Eric mentioned 2 of the 5-year model and the 4-year model. Both of those models send high school content down to the middle school and distribute it across 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. That's a fundamental assumption that acceleration is easier and it's more logical if you can get the middle schools involved. Another assumption we started with is that in accelerating a course pathway, nothing gets taken away. That the idea of the NGSS was always that it is a set of standards for all students. It's not all the science content a student can learn, but it's the science content that all students should learn. And so in an effort to accelerate, if you remove content, you're acting contrary to your own idea of acceleration. So all standards for all students was an idea that remained. The idea that the document does not provide a curriculum, I think, is sort of self-explanatory. It is a framework at best. Curriculum is something that's decided at the school and district level. It's a helper for people building a curriculum, but it is not a curriculum. Another assumption was that the engineering design standards, engineering for all, that idea does not get lost in an accelerated course model. The engineering design standards, at least in Kentucky, I know we had made the decision early on in adopting standards that engineering design is a part of every course. And so that thinking carried on to the Appendix K models and then to the advanced models as well, that the engineering design process is too important to get lost by simply putting it in a place. So you can't accelerate past engineering, that it's still there, just like if you were taking the non-accelerated course sequence. And then finally, another assumption that we operated with is the idea that this model course pathway, whichever one you choose, does not equal advanced level science coursework. There is no additional new science content added to any of these pathways. It's additional in the sense that something that you weren't normally expected to be covering as a teacher lands on your plate if you're teaching an accelerated course, but it's not a new or special PE that somehow fell from the sky. The advanced level here comes afterwards. The purpose of the accelerated pathway is to allow students more opportunity and or earlier opportunity to take advanced level science coursework, but it in and of itself is not advanced level science coursework. And so those are the key assumptions that we started with in building this document.
Thank you so much, Sean. So we're going to go to another poll question. We know that the document we're talking about today is specifically about acceleration in science, but it's much more common to have acceleration in other subjects like mathematics. So the poll question now is, does your school or district currently offer an acceleration option starting in middle school for science or for a subject other than science or in multiple subjects? So we'll give you a few more seconds to vote. And then we'll show the results. All right. So it looks like For schools or districts that only offer acceleration in science, it's a small minority, but many of you have experience with acceleration in other subjects. Sure. And now we're going to turn to Ellen Ebert, who will give us a little bit of perspective from the state education agency side on how she has used this document. Ellen?
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for the invitation to be here today to speak. So in thinking about the state perspective on the Accelerated Model Course Pathways document, you know, many thoughts came to mind, but to just kind of come down to a few that we can talk about in a few minutes. One of the biggest areas is around advisement, or what we call technical assistance. We're in a local control state. Washington is a local control state, so we would not be telling districts what they need to do, but we would be wanting to use this document and have used the document as a thinking tool. So this is one very great thinking document that's really useful for guiding decision-making processes when schools and districts think about an acceleration model for students who are in gifted and talented programs or may want to consider developing an accelerated program. For myself, we've used our state-led convening so that districts can talk to each other, pose questions, surface ideas, but we would further think about that as a school-to-school model, or bringing policymakers in, or bringing in folks from different areas so that there could be a broader conversation about what acceleration means and what acceleration means for having a coherent program in a school system. What we've found is that the document itself is great for surfacing problems of practice, great for surfacing questions around policy areas such as course-taking naming, so naming conventions, credits. In our own state, we have a lot of questions around the state assessment, the different assessments, but specifically around science. One would, if a student has accelerated, when would they be taking the test? What would they need to be sitting in a certain course? There are a lot of questions because our science test is, our science assessment is tied to graduation requirements. So that all falls under this broader area that I'm calling advisement, but it actually moves towards long-term planning. So we would advise districts that are thinking about developing model pathways for accelerating their students to really take the time to have a coherent way of planning over a long period of time. And when I say long period, I'm very realistic. I know that in some schools they just launch, and so they're ready to start in the new school year, and in other schools they take 2 to 3 years and they pilot. So I think there needs to be a vision towards college and career readiness, and we see that this is really clearly defined, or I wouldn't, maybe not the word defined, but identified in the Pathways document, and it scales to broader areas. It develops a conversation around what kinds of resources are needed if an accelerated model is adopted. So what kind of resources? Is there an elementary footprint? Is there a strong supporting program at elementary so that a 6th grader, if that's the model adopted, is ready to engage in this acceleration? What kind of professional learning needs do teachers need, and are they able to do this type of acceleration and stay true to the spirit of the next generation science standards or to the programs that they're trying to accelerate? And then which of the pathways is the best pathway for that particular school or district, and what kinds of supports are in place for the students and their parents? So that falls under this long-term planning kind of conversation. I always go to my higher ed partners and share with them the newest documents that are released nationally. They need to be able to think in terms of what needs their programs will will need to address in order to help teachers who are either in service or pre-service to think about what an acceleration means. Because I think Sean did a really great job explaining that it's not add-on, but it's a faster way of doing things. So helping our higher ed colleagues be part of the conversation is something that the state would want to consider as an accelerated pathways document moves through the system. I think I'm going to jump to exemplars first before I go to grants. It's critical to identify schools that are and districts that are trying to be early adopters of an accelerated plan. One of the things that we find is that very thoughtful schools have considered all of the things that I've talked about. They've been mapping and planning for at least a year, and they have put in place structures for them to continuously visit, revisit, iterate, and so forth. And they can become models and exemplars for other schools and districts, and they have tremendous lessons learned that they can be shared. Stepping out of all of that, from the state perspective, when we understand what schools and districts are doing, then we can help find, locate, identify, or sponsor grants that help support the work that schools and districts are doing. And so it's a great opportunity to make connections and to have community efforts as well. And then not finally, but importantly, is this notion of students who have been underserved having an equitable opportunity to engage in the accelerated programs. So from the state's perspective, making sure that all students are in the place where they can be supported through elementary school, no matter what particular population of students they represent, that they have an opportunity to engage in this acceleration learning opportunity. So I think that those are the top areas that I would identify from the state perspective.
Great, thank you, Ellen. We're going to turn it over to Sean again so he can give us a district perspective. Sean?
Yes, okay, thanks. So from the district perspective, I think there is a lot of similarity with what Ellen said, and I think there will probably be a lot of similarity with at the school or local perspective as well. But one of the things that the document I think does particularly well is, and this sounds simplistic, but it's important, which is simply that it establishes that there is a precedent for acceleration. And the idea of having an accelerated pathway is somewhat new probably in science. I think there are places where math acceleration has happened for a while, but for science it's sort of new, and especially when you look at the complexity of, by definition, NGSS is a new set of standards, even for the states that have been in them for a while. And so the idea that we're tackling this new set of standards and then we're going to try to accelerate beyond that might be a little daunting, but it's also probably a great idea for those students who can really benefit from it. So having the document to be able, as a district, to just say, or as a teacher to say to the district, that there's a precedent here that allows you to advocate to say, see, look, somebody's already thinking about doing this. In fact, they've put together this manual to help us. So I think having the document just as a proof of concept is valuable at the district level to be able to say, we do not have to completely invent this thing. People, and the same people who built the standards, have thought about how we can make them move faster to get more kids into the advanced level courses. And that's, like I said, seems like sort of an obvious and perhaps a silly stepping stone, but it's an important one because nothing that ends that doesn't get began. So you have to start somewhere, and starting with the possible is not a bad idea. I think the biggest piece is the idea that since most of the models in the document rely on the idea of acceleration beginning in 6th grade, is that the district uses this document as the framework to start the conversations between the middle schools and the high schools. And not only that, but to help think about what are the configurations. And obviously, if you're a small district that has one middle school and one high school, that's a much easier conversation than if you're a multi-school district, especially if you're a multi-school district where the middle schools don't necessarily all feed to the same high school, so you have large logistical conversations that need to happen. Does a district want to say, okay, so we want to make this accelerated pathway available in every school, every middle school feeding every high school, and have a uniform district accelerated pathway and build a curriculum for that? Do we want to maybe do this in pockets or centers to have like an acceleration magnet middle school where or middle schools, a couple of schools out of a bunch where this pathway is made available and students who are identified as gifted in science at the end of their elementary years decide to make the choice to do the accelerated pathway, who know already way in advance that they want to do AP in high school or to do advanced coursework or to enter the STEM field in some way, can apply to or get preferential placement in those schools. Those are all decisions that the districts have to make, and looking at the models in this document are useful because that allows districts to make decisions about resource allocation. In this case, particularly the resource of teachers who have the necessary skills and dispositions to accomplish this acceleration, particularly in middle school. It seems less of an issue because most high school teachers are pretty well immersed in a content. Now, that's not a slight on middle school teachers, and it's not an elevation of high school teachers as well, because there are lots of teachers who are immersed very deeply in one sort of content but are forbidden by law from teaching another by the virtue of their certification. Like, for example, I could not legally teach biology. I could teach an integrated course, but at some point when the amount of biology in that course becomes too high, my state says, no, you're a physics teacher teaching life science, and that doesn't work. So those are all kinds of issues that districts will have to grapple with, and looking at the relative distribution of content in the model course pathways will help districts say, maybe we need to think about having teacher X in school Y because teacher X has the particular grasp of content that school Y needs to effectively send kids on at the end of 8th grade who have gotten a quality acceleration and are really ready for that even more accelerated 9th grade course. It also helps schools think about building curriculum, and obviously the curriculum, typically, depending on where you are, is either a district decision or a school decision, but with the caution, of course, that the model course pathways are not a curriculum. They do provide a thinking framework for helping schools to build a curriculum, and there's no need for a district to start that from scratch, given all the thought that went into this document. Another thing that it helps think about is professional learning needs for all of the folks involved, because this shifting of standards, earth science into places where earth science perhaps didn't go before, and the moving down with some more complex ideas from high school to middle, might require very targeted and specific professional learning for teachers at all levels in order to be successful with implementing the pathways to the level of rigor that the NGSS demands. And so that document helps make the decision about, well, so as a district we probably need to offer some intensive earth science training in 6th and 7th grade to make sure that our teachers are up to speed and things of that nature. And I think it also allows the conversation to happen. Those of you who are familiar with the document will notice that there are a couple of different approaches in terms of, regardless of which acceleration model you choose, how you implement it as you phase in AP courses. One possible model is the idea that the NGSS and the AP content are completely separate from each other. The assumption is made that A, we teach all of the NGSS, and then B, kids transition into one or more AP courses, and those standards are those standards and these standards are these standards. But there's also a model or a line of thought that says there's such an overlap of content between the foundational standards in NGSS and the more advanced AP standards that there are things that are common that a negotiation can happen to say, okay, so if you cover this in the basic course, then we can make the assumption our kids have taken it to proficiency, and we do not have to address it in AP, freeing us up to speed up AP or to spend more time on other areas. That's a conversation that needs to happen between the middle schools and the high schools, and that's something that, especially in larger districts, it needs to happen. And so that is another idea that this document can be helpful for the district. And so I think that's probably plenty of value we've squeezed out of it at the district level. And so I think Eric's now going to talk about how it works at the school level.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I think we'll have a lot of things in common in terms of what we'll share. I'll try to give folks a perspective of what we've tried here in our school. But let me really start by saying, obviously we're interested in finding solutions for all kids, and that's, of course, what everybody is interested in as educators. And we're really at the beginning of a 6-12 integration process. We're far from complete. We're just kind of playing with it. So don't feel like if you're not there, that's a bad thing. So I teach here at Mankato West High School. It's one of 3 high schools in a district that we have about 7,000 students. And we're a K-12 district in a regional center in southern Minnesota. And the accelerated model course maps are really a great tool, I think, that can help us to keep building a system to support students that are ready for this kind of acceleration. At this point, my school district really, like I said, it's in the infancy of using these models. We're thinking about them. We've tried a particular thing I'll tell you about at one course level, but we're really looking constantly at our curriculum and thinking about how it does meet the needs of kids, and particularly as we're changing to a much more focused on college and career ready and ELA standards throughout. So our school district moved to a physics first program in our high schools 5 years ago. So at this current time, students in our 3 high schools take physics at grade 9, chemistry at grade 10, biology at grade 11, and science electives as they choose along the way and after those 3, including some AP courses and some other non-AP courses. So we've built an accelerated program into that in the high school where some of our students take the physics course and the chemistry course in an accelerated model with 1 semester of physics and 1 semester of chemistry at the 9th grade. And these students have more opportunities then to enroll in the AP courses and other advanced electives sooner. We really attempt to do the same physics and the same chemistry, but intentionally not as much instruction in mathematics at that same course, and it gives the kids a little more opportunity for time. So I think I also want to point out about how Sean talked about the accelerated course pathways are models and not a curriculum. This is really a model, and models in science are useful for lots of things, but they also have limitations. I think of a model as a way to understand a system, and this model really provides a solid framework for planning and for organizing our science content. It gives us a starting point that we can use to look hard at how we integrate science concept effectively so that we end up utilizing the skills of all of our teachers, and that might have to be different for this accelerated program. So in our curriculum right now, if I step back a few more years, students take a general science course in grade 6, a life science-based course in grade 7, earth science-based course in grade 8, and then physics 9, chemistry 10, biology 11. And I'm hopeful we can use these model pathways to really do some more creative, accelerated integration of content as we move forward. I want to distinguish a little bit in the planning phases, because when we do curriculum development, really looking at our systems level work, we feel like that's about finding what is common for all kids across the courses, across the schools, and really organizing ideas like these models support. But then, of course, there's the day-to-day instructional planning that those of us that are teachers work in on a regular basis. And that really happens with our teachers as we collaborate together and we plan what it is we're going to do literally in our classrooms and our labs daily. And I think the multidisciplinary approach that the model promotes allows us for the opportunity for cross-collaboration to really be responsive to our students' needs, though it's maybe not what we're used to, and I think that's okay. But it, I think, will allow us to tap into the different skills of different teachers and really, at the same time, challenges us structurally a little bit at ways to do that. Ultimately, it's about us as teachers in our school district really owning the plan for what we help kids to learn about. We know our students best and, of course, can make the courses work together with our colleagues. And I think this really is going to support the vertical conversations as we start to look in our district more at science grade 7, or excuse me, grade 6 through 12. Like I say, we've begun to try this at 9, and it's influencing 9, 10, 11, but now I think it's time we can begin to look the other direction also. So the model course pathways help us to think about what courses and combinations ideas can fit well into a program, and really help students develop ideas most logically over time. That concept of storyline is really something we tried to emphasize as we looked at putting together the documents. And I do think this will take some time, and I think that's okay. As Sean pointed out, these pathways really give us a good tool to organize. So the bottom line, whether or not we are an NGSS state, in fact in Minnesota we're not right now, is that these become great models to talk together about and really help us to talk about best practices in science education.
Great, thank you, Eric, and thank you to Ellen and Sean as well. Those are really helpful perspectives, and we hope that you enjoyed hearing about this document and how it can be used from all three perspectives. We are now going to start answering some of the questions that have been trickling in. So please, as you come up with more questions, feel free to send them, and then we'll work them into the rotation. But first, and this is open to all three of you panelists, when we're thinking about the development of these pathways, what were things that we had to take into consideration? Sean, you want to start?
Well, honestly, the first thing we had to take into consideration, I think, is the fact that we had to make sure that we did not lose the inherent integrity of the NGSS in squishing together some sort of mishmash of content, because so much attention had been given to the idea of building a cohesive storyline, standards that make sense, that just cutting and chopping and pasting them ran the risk of turning it into just a sort of a death march through the bullets, right? Okay, check that one off, check that one off, jumping from idea to idea without having any real sense of how it connected to the thing you learned previously. And I don't want to go too deep down the rat hole of the terminology of the NGSS, but there was a real desire to make sure that we didn't lose the focus on the sort of the non-content pieces, the idea of the non-content content, for lack of a better way of saying it, or as I say to people new to the NGSS, the stuff in the blue box and the stuff in the green box. The idea that the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts were important pieces that might very well get sacrificed because the stuff in the orange box in the middle of the disciplinary core ideas felt more like the traditional content of the old sort of just cram it in their way of teaching science. And the thing that was always on my mind was we've got to make sure that we honor the intent of these standards and don't turn it into a race to see who can memorize the most stuff in the shortest amount of time.
I'll add to that I think the storyline concept really, I think, was helpful to the work we tried to do with this merging, if you will, of different standards. I mean, there were places where one of the examples that just comes to mind, which I apologize that it is science, but where we talked about how you need to have heredity information before you can think about evolution, and there are particular topics that need to come in sequence. And at the same time, there were places in one area that we were thinking about Earth and Earth systems, and then in a whole different traditional course, some other ideas came up that were related to those. And yet, as we thought about the pathways, just thinking about common topics that may yet appear in different traditional course areas and the ways they could go together. I think that was kind of part of the most exciting work about this, and I think really could apply to any area, not just in science, but the commonalities that occur that maybe force us a little bit more out of the more traditional silos that we tend to exist in.
There was also a lot of conversation about how do we do this in such a way that it provides a natural support for AP coursework, so that kids come out of the end of it ready to immediately leap into the rigorous coursework of AP, so that it's not like the stuff I most need to know was the stuff that I learned the longest ago, that there was a scaffolding of complexity and retention, so that it was a logical flow from when the kid sits down at the desk in August in 6th grade to the time they leave in May in either 9th or 10th grade, ready to tackle that first AP course.
You know, one thing that I would add, Sean and Eric, is how nice the document adheres to the guiding principles of the K-12 framework for science education. And the one specifically, Sean, you mentioned about not wanting to race through content and bullets and so forth. And I think that just goes and supports this idea that children need to learn over time and that they require practice. And I think that the way you've described how the pathway documents were really thoughtfully considered supports that guiding principle.
Thank you.
Thank you. So another question that came from the audience is, will there be an issue with state laws and having enough qualified teachers in the middle school teaching high school content or classes that have that kind of high school content in them?
If I can tackle that one a little bit. Now, speaking from the district perspective, and specifically for my state, I don't necessarily see that as an issue because the students are not, now like I said, it may vary in someone else's state, but in my particular case, the students aren't being awarded high school credit. They're still taking a 6th grade, a 7th grade, and an 8th grade class. Yes, they're learning the high school content, but the teachers are certified to teach the middle school content, and the high school is just an add-on piece. So there's not a question of them receiving credit because they will actually be receiving the credit for courses in high school. It's not like the 8th grade class is being applied to their high school transcript. So in our particular case, the certification issue is less about the content and more about the credit. And since the credit for high school doesn't start being given until the high school year, that would not be an issue in my particular state. If it were an issue, that's one of the things that I talked about, that it's a decision that the district needs to make about resource allocation. So maybe if you want to do that, that's when you look at one of your stronger high school teachers who also happens to have the middle school certification and say to them, we need you to be our 8th grade person to make this acceleration happen because you have the certification we need. Or alternately, you say to 6th, 7th, and 8th grade teachers, we really need to bolster your learning and perhaps even get you on a certification path to make you be able to conform with our particular set of state standards. But in my particular state, since it's about credits and not content, that wouldn't be an issue.
All right, next question. What can districts and schools do to ensure that offering accelerated pathways does not lead to student tracking and inequitable science learning?
Well, since I'm the district representative, I hate to be the voice people hear the most, but since I'm the official district representative, I would say that from a district perspective, the main thing you do is that you limit the pathway to those people for whom it's truly appropriate. And I think that the premise of that question is that somehow if we put kids in an accelerated path, which is sort of by definition a track, that doesn't mean that the rest of the kids don't take science. The NGSS is still an expectation for, I mean, those are our state standards. Those are an expectation for every student. So no matter what we do with this small handful of gifted students identified for acceleration, that doesn't in any way take away our responsibility to teach the full breadth of the standards to the rest of them. And if our own good nature weren't sufficient, the fact that every single one of those kids is going to be eventually taking an assessment, a high-stakes assessment, based on the NGSS, that would be reason number 2 to make sure that they don't get forgotten. So just because we're accelerating for Group A doesn't mean that we can just leave Group B sitting at the bus station. They all are required to have the opportunity to learn the entire breadth of the standards.
Yeah, I can echo that here in our situation, that I think we certainly select students for this particular course that we do at 9th grade, but I think it doesn't hurt the integrity of the physics that everyone else gets. In fact, I think it's maybe a good thing because it makes that group just a little more homogeneous. But it also takes the kids for which it's appropriate to accelerate and gives them that opportunity. I mean, in a sense, it's really differentiation at a systematic level, which I think is a really good thing in this case, to equip kids with the most that we can.
You know, one of the things that I might add is that from the state level anyway, the question really gets very complicated when you start thinking about very small schools, very rural schools, schools that are very isolated, and versus very high urban areas. And you know, from the state perspective, we would want to be making sure that there are equitable access for our students to engage in the best programs that are available. And so there is a lot of conversation that's occurring, I think, across the country about how do we do that? How do we make these opportunities available? Because you may have one student in a school that's only got 5 students in the high school. So it becomes a very complicated conversation to have. When I think about this morning, I was thinking about how an AVID program that begins in middle school could really be supporting an acceleration model, but then that implies that the school has an AVID program. So I don't think there's one easy answer, and I think that it's very specific to what are the community and school district resources that are available and what the situation is. So it could even be that from this Pathways document that perhaps a bit of a rubric emanates so that you could do a checklist of, well, we've got this, this, and this, so we can probably move towards this particular pathway and have a justification, whereas it may not work out. And I don't know that across the country we're quite there yet in terms of being able to you know, be more flexible in how we have the programs available to all our children who are capable and able to engage in the acceleration.
All right, to follow up on that question, someone asked, in an accelerated pathway model, would you envision that a student might enter the pathway in some grade other than 6th grade? Students come into their own at different times, and can an accelerated pathway allow for this?
Well,
yes. I would answer absolutely to that. And at the same time, in the document, there is some suggestions about ways that you might need to remediate. I'm not sure if that really feels like the right word, but you might need to help that student that might choose to hop in at 7th or 8th grade to get up to speed on some other particular ideas, and that's described pretty well in the document with some ideas. But bottom line, I think the answer is absolutely. If a student is motivated to work in that way, I would hate to say no to them, and I think we'd want to think systematically about how we could make a pathway for that student.
Yeah, and the document offers some options. It offers a list of, if a kid enters in 7th grade, here's what you need to catch them up on, and then it suggests some options. And of course, all those options are either great or terrible depending on whether they're available in your district or not. So like most things, the bigger schools probably have an advantage there. But yeah, the authors thought very specifically about what happens if a student decides not in 6th grade that they want to be part of this, and so it's there.
Thank you. Another question from the audience, why not align to the AP Environmental Science course? So I think that's because the appendices show connections between the NGSF and AP Bio, AP Physics, and AP Chemistry, but not AP Environmental Science.
The document was under revision at the time. The AP Environmental Science standards were under revision at the time, and they were not to the same level of detail that the others that had been revised. And so it seemed like that's something to be done at a later date.
Yeah, the chem and the physics and the bio are very freshly reorganized and reorganized is the best word, I guess, in the AP program. So reiterating that, yeah, it really did make sense for those courses, and I think that would be a great direction to go soon. Is supporting AP Environmental in the same way.
Great, thank you. This was a specific question for Eric. Eric, what percentage of your students are accelerated?
The best answer is it really depends on the year and the population of students. We use a rubric that we've established as a school district to make that decision on each class of kids, but typically it's about 15%. This particular year, I teach the physics, we call it Physics X. I taught the Physics X course this fall semester, and I had 2 sections of ballpark 28, 30 kids. A year ago, it was smaller than that. It was in the neighborhood of 35 in one section. But we have developed a rubric that we use that's very specific, where we look at a couple years of standardized mathematics scores, one minimum qualifier in a reading score, and the previous year's enrollment in a math course. And we use that on a rubric to assign students a point value, and then use that to invite kids. So really we try to be very consistent in using that rubric as a tool across our district, so we are consistent. And recently we found some occasions where a student has come in without some data, and they've said to us, hey, I might fit, and we've certainly worked to accommodate that pretty successfully.
Great, thank you. Another question from the audience. Do any of you have examples of creative ways that teachers have worked with the extra standards without creating a new course? Our school does not offer accelerated classes in middle school. So what are some options when acceleration is not necessarily an option?
So I can speak to the schools that I visit across the state of Washington, and what I have seen is a collaborative effort among the faculty to create this challenge-based learning for students, so that they study questions of interest that are not easily defined, and in doing so they are using standards from multiple disciplines. They're using their community resources. They're engaging with experts from the field. So I think that that's probably the best way that I've seen creativity going on in schools, is that they've gone to phenomenon-based study, challenge-based questions, and they're working together.
Thanks. Any thoughts on that from Sean or Eric?
There are no thoughts from Sean. I think, or not really, but that doesn't stop me from talking. I think that we are still kind of in the infancy of implementation, and in my particular district, we have not yet begun to implement an accelerated pathway yet, although we are having the discussion. I think that the most clever thing that we've seen for acceleration are honestly the things that we've seen that are just the transition to really good NGSS teaching, which is the idea of trying to teach the standards built around an organizing phenomenon that students can really engage in. So the idea of having really strongly engaging contexts makes it easier for teachers to sneak in those extra standards without students noticing, hey, this is much more learning than I used to do because I'm finding it interesting.
All right, thank you. Another question, is there a guide for curriculum or for pacing within these models?
No, it's pretty specific. The document's pretty specifically designed to be a framework for people to do their own curriculum and pacing guide building. And I think that kind of stuff to the curriculum level is so specific to a particular schedule type, if you're trimester versus block versus full year, and whether you're 7-period day, 6-period day, and just honestly the character and dispositions of teachers and the certification issues, that it would be almost impossible to build a one-size-fits-all curriculum or pacing guide, and that was never the intent of the document, to get down to the level of curriculum. It was really just a framework at the standards level.
Okay, so last question. We're running up to the end of the webinar. Someone asked if the rubric used by Eric's district or school can be shared with other states.
I think the important part of the rubric I'll be happy to share, and that is the concept of what we use to make the selection. I mean, we have specific scores in NWA that we use that I don't know that would be meaningful to anyone, but so we develop a rubric. It's a rubric that has 3 areas on it, and the first is an NWA math score at 7th grade. So we look at the student's math score, and we give them a 4, a 3, a 2, a 1, or a 0 based on the range that score falls in, and that probably varies a little bit by year. We look at the 8th grade, same thing, the NWA math score at 8th grade, same thing with the rubric. And then we look at the math course that the student takes in 8th grade. If a student is already in a geometry course at 8th grade, we give them 4 points on the rubric. If they're in Algebra 1 enriched, we give them 2 points. And if they're in Algebra 1 or lower, they don't get any points on the rubric. So it's really nothing magic. It's just looking at which students seem to be most mathematically ready to tackle the course. I mean, we teach physics at 9th grade intentionally as an algebra-based course. That was a question that came up earlier, because we really believe that if students have had algebra in 8th grade, which they have in Minnesota, there's no reason they can't do the physics that is involved in what most people would call a, quote, traditional physics course. So that's the reason for this course. When we do the acceleration, we look at math specifically because it helps us to know which students are most capable to really develop the new scientific concepts using the math they already have as a scaffolding. Does that answer somewhat the question, folks? Panelists, help me out.
Yeah, I think so. If you, whatever you feel comfortable sharing, Eric, we can put online together with this presentation and make that available to all the participants. Mm-hmm.
I will check with my school district and make sure they're comfortable with that. But really, I mean, the concept is part of our 9th grade physics course is helping students to learn mathematics with physics. They learn mathematics at 8th grade, but in physics in 9th grade, it's wonderful to think about the mathematics and the physics together because, of course, they fit so well together. And if we can spend a little less time on the specific mathematics support and more time on the physics concepts, that's the decision that we use to decide which students fit best into that model, and that really makes, so far, a pretty good decision. I mean, I've been teaching the course now for several years, and it seems like our criteria works pretty well, with some exceptions. But to get those kids that are most able is part of it, and willing is, of course, part of it too, but they tend to go relatively together to do that.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for sharing their thoughts with us today and their development process. We're going to close with another poll question. Have you, in the audience, already used the Accelerated NGSS Model Course Pathways document? Or if no, do you now have plans to use it, hearing the different considerations? So we'll just take a few seconds to fill out the poll. All right. It sounds like many of you now have plans to use it, which is fantastic. So thank you all so much for listening today. If you have any questions for the panelists or for Achieve, feel free to contact us at achieve.org. And the Accelerated Pathways document is, of course, to the right side of your screen in the handouts, and it's also at nextgenscience.org on the Resources tab. Thank you again.